So just picking right back up where we left off, we're going to talk about Rizzolatti's premotor theory. So this is a theory specifically about selective spatial attention, and it comes from a lot of evidence that we have with single cell recordings from monkeys. And so this proposes that the frontal eye fields, which is located right here, I'm kind of circling this in red, these are really important for the system, right, that is going to control both spatial attention and motor planning or action. And so think about, planning eye movements to direct attention. And it's a pretty bold claim. So this premotor theory is a pretty bold claim in of itself. There's some issues with it we're going to talk about in just a second. But the idea is that these frontal eye fields have two separate groups of neurons, and you have one group that's important for covert shifts of attention without eye movements, and then another group that's important for overt shifts of attention with eye movements. It could be that there is a sort of a visual salience map that's important here. So think of these are neurons or areas in the brain that are important for identifying potential eye targets for eye movements. It might not serve as a specific movement plan, an eye movement plan, but just as kind of a salience map. Some other work indicates that the visual system corresponds to a mental spotlight of attention, not necessarily incorporating the motor system here. So really, what it boils down to is that we have this really bold claim that says that attention and motor control use the same neural circuit, and that motor activation is both necessary and sufficient for spatial attention. That's a really, really bold claim. It's not really super supported by other evidence. In fact, it suggests that it might be separate neural systems, neural circuits, and so we have to think about these movements, these saccades. These are they separate from what's driving attentional selections? Are they the same? Are they integrating the same system? And I think that this premotor theory is really interesting to consider, but might be sort of too preliminary in the claims because some of the evidence sort of contradicts it. Another potential theory to consider with attention is the biased competition theory presented by Ruff. This is also, think of this as like an integrated competition. It's really similar to global workspace theory in the sense that attention is going to win the competition. And so inputs are all competing for neural representation. And so if attention is this neural competition mechanism, it's going to be influenced by feedback from things like your emotional state, your goals, your expectations. And this is something that we see that we've actually demonstrated in class or will be demonstrating when it comes to looking at sort of like goal-directed behavior and how that changes what you focus on and what your attention is. And so this idea is that there's a competition here, but it's biased based off of these other cognitive processes. And again, it's really similar to this idea of global workspace theory, where there's a lot going on, and there are some things that are going to receive almost like a spotlight, and that in that case is going to be what competes with other things. This final theory that we have on here, this is the attention schema theory. This is proposed by Michael Graziano. It comes from a cognitive neuroscience foundation with an evolutionary focus. And so what this is essentially a combination theory, right? So it builds on this bias-based competition. So this is actually building off of this idea that attention is a competition. It builds off of global workspace theory. And it also integrates the integrated information theory, IIT, which we've talked about before, giving sort of a number to the idea of consciousness, right? So, the higher your number, the more conscious you are. And it directly connects consciousness with attention. And this is going to be important as we talk about the relationship between consciousness and attention later on, that there are some theories that say that they're causally related, some theories that say that they're not related at all, and some that say that might be correlated. So this attention schema theory is specifically using the idea that awareness is the internal model of attention, right? And so that awareness and attention has evolved as a way of modeling and controlling attention. So this is an evolutionary mechanism. And you kind of think about it as if we have a sort of a simplified, if the brain can use a simplified model of attention itself, then we can control this top-down process of what is it that we're focusing on. And so if it's beneficial to the organism, then of course, the more control that you have over the system, the better. And then you do have other elements that are grabbing your attention for survival benefits, but we want to be able to know what is it that we need to pay attention to and what is it that we can ignore. And so if you think about the human, right, the human in of itself, this model actually connects consciousness directly with attention. And if you think about how the human is basically saying, well, I am conscious, right? I claim to have consciousness, and I'm going to assign a high degree of certainty to that conclusion because that is my experience and that is what my subjective awareness tells me. So the attention schema theory is really interesting because thinking of attention as, a direct result of your environment and of your experience as we've learned what schemas are, and that this is, something that is going to be kind of integrating in other theories and other ideas. It's a nice model because it considers so many other aspects of consciousness, awareness, and attention. Now, there are other alternative theories, right? So there are some alternatives that reduce attention to a neural process or just a computational process. I think that many of the theories, including, for example, attention schema theory, looks at, shaping our experience of the world. It is shaped by and shapes our experience. And then we have, of course, other views that are more structuring in terms of structuring view of attention, and that attention is a contrast, right? So it structures our mental life because it brings some things in the foreground compared to others. We can't pay attention to every single thing, so there is choice and there is control over what things that you choose to selectively pay attention to. Now, of course, that there's other theories that it treats attention not necessarily as a process in of itself, but sort of a manner in which things happen. So if you think about attention as being sort of the word attention being a noun, right? It's a thing, it's something that we can talk about as a thing that we do, or a thing that is a fillable, like a container. If you think about the different theories that we've talked about thus far. There are other theories that treat it instead like an adverb, right? So treating consciousness as sort of a manner in which things happen versus a process, a thing in of itself. There's another particular theory called we're going back here. There's another particular theory that we can talk about called the cognitive unison theory. That's another one where the cognitive unison view of attention is looking at, for example, instead of looking at the what, right? You're shifting the question to how. How is it that we can take a person and take into account what it takes for a person to perform a task attentively rather than inattentively? So how is it that we're engaging into these tasks instead of specifically what is attention and what are these elements? We also have other theories that, and a lot of these tend to be more philosophical, that attempt to unify both attention and consciousness. And I think that some of these theories, are a good segue into the connection of consciousness and attention. And it's like, are they causally related? Are they correlated? How is it? So it brings us nicely into this next sort of topic of the 6 main possibilities of the relationship between consciousness and attention. And so we've got 2 of these 6 that are causal relationships, right? So either consciousness depends on attention or attention depends on consciousness. We have a correlation idea. So it's like, okay, well, they're not causally related, but they are related, right? We have no relation whatsoever, no causal link. And then we have this idea that consciousness and attention are the same thing, or that they are either not anything, they're not, they don't exist, or that they aren't what we think that they are. So we're going to walk through each one of these individually, kind of group them together into the causal versus non-causal types of things, and then we'll go over this last one at the sort of in the end. So of the causal connections, so one of the common ones to consider is that consciousness depends on attention, right? So almost all processing-based theories of attention propose that consciousness is a result of attention, right? So it's a result of attention. And we can look at, for example, the spotlight view, filter view, perceptual load, premotor, working memory accounts. They all take this view that consciousness must be dependent on attention. You have to be paying attention first before you can have conscious awareness. And it may be that attention is necessary, right, to allow or create a conscious experience, but in of itself, it's not sufficient alone, right? So we think about this idea between being necessary versus being sufficient. So attention may be necessary to allow or create a conscious experience, but not on its own sufficient to do so. And so there's a couple of experiments that we can think about that can give us evidence for this. So, for example, inattentional blindness, and we'll talk about specifically the gorilla experiment where we'll actually do this in class. But when we think about inattentional blindness, if you're not actively paying attention to it, right, then you're not going to be conscious of it. And so this causal connection that consciousness depends on attention is specific to a lot of these experiments that we can do, where we say, well, if you aren't paying attention, then you're not aware or conscious of the thing that happens. So that's one potential causal connection. Another causal connection is the opposite, right? That attention depends on consciousness. So we consciously choose what we're looking at, what we're listening to, okay? Now, what's really important here is that there's not as much empirical evidence to support this, but William James was a very big proponent of this causal connection, saying that attention depends on consciousness, not because of any empirical work done on it, but specifically because of the idea of free will. William James says, basically, if this is not true, if attention does not depend on consciousness, then what is it that we say that we're in control of? And how do we have free will? How is it that we're able to dictate what are the things that we tend to and that we're conscious of? And so this one's a really interesting one because it's really hard to empirically test, but also you think about like this idea of free will, right? And so William James is a huge proponent of free will. Now, these are the causal connections. So the 2 out of the 6 are either, consciousness, depends on attention, or attention depends on consciousness. The non-causal connections, we have 3 of these that we're going to go over. So this one here, this first one is attention and consciousness may be correlated. They may be related. Remember that when it comes to correlation, we have 2 factors that are related in a patterned way, right? So as one increases, the other increases. As the other one increases, the other one decreases. There's a relationship between the 2, but they're not necessarily causally related. A doesn't cause B. Correlation doesn't mean causation, right? And so in this case, it could be a third or fourth or infinity variable that influences the both. And so what this suggests is that attention may not necessarily be necessary for consciousness, okay? And I think that this is something that we can kind of all relate to in a way that we think about, for example, listening to music. So awareness of things that we're not attending to, these are an intrinsic and valuable part of our experience, right? So listening to music, you're not singling out necessarily like the guitar or the piano. You can enjoy the overall melody without singling out every little piece. So, this is an important part, that we are aware of the things that we're not necessarily specifically selectively attending to, but we can enjoy and experience the stimuli around us and the environment around us without having to attend to every little thing. And so, this is this idea that, these things are related, but not necessarily attention causing consciousness or the other way around. Another non-causal connection is that there is no causal link at all between attention and consciousness, right? And so if we think about this kind of idea, is that consciousness and selective attention are so different that they're distinct processes. And so what this does is consciousness does not reduce down to attention. And we can look at this in a couple of different ways. And one particular example is using something called the binocular suppression task. So basically giving two images to the eyes and being able to suppress one of these images to be able to see what you're looking at, right? And so what we see is that activity in the V1 area of the visual system tends to be more influenced more strongly by directing attention to a target necessarily than by directing attention to a target than being aware of it. And so, this kind of suggests that attention and consciousness could be distinct processes. And we also see sometimes, this is just like everyday life, sometimes awareness and attention can have opposite effects. So if we look at, for example, after images, right? And some of you may be familiar with this idea from sensation and perception. When the retina adapts to overstimulation, the visual system is going to generate an after image, and that's an absence of awareness, right? So we couldn't consider it a perceptual suppression. And if you pay attention to the after image, if you have sustained attention on it, it actually makes the after image weaker. So if we think about this in a way, another example could be, have you ever practiced an activity that's like a skilled activity that doesn't require conscious attention? So if you're doing something sort of not thinking about it, so let's say you're really, really good at shooting 3-point shots in basketball, and you just grab the ball and you throw it, and you're not really requiring a lot of conscious effort, conscious attention to it. But when somebody calls you out and says, I want you to concentrate on this activity and I want you to think about all of the steps that you're doing, we tend to mess this up, right? So when we are hyper-focused on a particular activity or skill, we can actually do worse on it. So bringing conscious awareness to something and bringing attention to it, that can actually kind of compete with one another. And so that idea is that maybe they are distinct processes, since one may or may not actually be impacted by the other. So those are just some interesting things that you can think about that you've experienced yourself, that potentially consciousness and selective attention are in fact distinct processes. Another kind of idea here is just lumping them together and saying, hey, maybe they're the same thing. Maybe attention and consciousness are absolutely the same thing. And the things that we think of, the functions that we think of as attentional, are just manifestations of general processing. If we think about like bottlenecks and spotlights of attention, that they're consequences of global integrated neural interactions, and those consequences, outcomes, is just conscious attention, they're just all the same thing. We're all talking about the same processes, and that they're not distinct in any way. This is one of those particular ideas that I'm not a huge fan of, because when you lump them together and say we're all just talking about the same thing, it becomes really difficult, because then less people want to study it. They want to say, well, if it's not a distinct process, if this is all the same integrated process, then why bother even looking at it? And I think it doesn't even explain it away. It just sort of just assumes that it doesn't exist in the capacity that we're thinking of, right? So it's that attention and consciousness do exist. They're just literally the same process. And so why bother trying to differentiate them? And I think it is important to think about differentiating them. And the final potential connection is no connection at all, no causal connection, because attention and consciousness either don't exist, okay, they're not distinct processes, they don't exist at all, or they're not what they seem. They're illusory, they're an illusion, and it's not possible to actually separate it out in terms of a physiological process or a location in the brain, an anatomical location in the brain, or a different function. And so because we have a really hard time locating specific centers, specific circuits, for example, Alport takes the view that there's just no way to separate attention from the rest of the brain, therefore why bother even trying to find the place where it exists, right? Another interesting thing is that this approach is looking at attention as just a type of thinking. The argument is that attention looks more like thinking than like perception. And so it isn't what we think it is, right? So it's not a type of perception, it's just a process like decision making, like thinking. And so, again, this is kind of taking the view that perhaps it isn't, doesn't really exist in of itself. Sebastian Waltz also said that basically attention is the mental activity of structuring the stream of consciousness. And so it doesn't really give a reality or existence to either. So it's just, again, like it is not something that's separate. It's not something that we can really identify. When we look at some of the experiments to try to understand the personal conscious experience. In the 1960s, George Sperling did a set of experiments looking at something called sensory memory. And now this is, bringing it back to some of the historical stuff that was done. So essentially, sensory memory is very, very difficult to nail down because it's so fast. If you're talking about fractions of a second, how do you know what sticks in those fractions of a second of a person's conscious knowledge, right? And so sensory memory, thinking of like echoic memory, so what you can hear, iconic memory, what you can see, all of the things that are in your environment that you can attend to at any given time is in your sensory memory. Sensory memory has a huge capacity, but is extremely fleeting. There's only certain things that you're going to need to attend to that's going to kind of move from sensory memory into short-term memory or into working memory. So George Sperling was really interested in this idea of visual sensory memory, iconic memory, and how we can capture the amounts of information that we can sort of attend to at any given time. And so this is an example, this right here, of George Sperling's experiment. So what he would do is have a person look at a screen, and it would show 12 letters, okay, and it would give these letters in rows, okay, and so a person was trained that they're going to look at this whole set of rows of letters, and they're going to hear a specific tone, okay, and so if the tone, for example, is really high, then that would mean that you'd have to report the top line. If the tone was medium, then you would have to report back the middle letters. And if it's a really low tone, then you'd have to report back the bottom letters. And a person does not know ahead of time which line they're going to have to report back. So it's always like a randomized experiment. So they see these 12 flashes for 50 milliseconds, which is just a fraction of time, right? They're going to see this flash. The screen is going to go blank. They're going to hear this tone. So in this case, this was like the middle tone. And within 250 milliseconds, they have to recall what letters did they specifically see for that line. And so in this case, this was the middle row. And so the person reports back 3 out of the 4 letters. This is what they remember, okay? And so what this is trying to capture what sticks in that sensory memory for that very fraction small part. What are you consciously aware of in that given time frame? What is it that of all these letters, okay, we're going to have you report back the middle row. Of the middle row, what can you remember? And so what's interesting about this is not only what you report, right? So this person remembered 3 out of 4 letters, but also what you failed to report. So they failed to report this V, and of course they failed to report any of the letters that's on the top or bottom row. And so what's really interesting is being able to say, like, okay, if we're looking at what comes into your conscious awareness, right? Looking at these kinds of experiments, as well as other experiments about after images, right? So what part of the image is in your perceptual awareness, and what image is in your conscious awareness, right? So what's perception versus actual awareness, and comparing the two. So after image experiments, for example, a person who sees an image seconds after the image disappears, we actually see the V4 section of the brain activate, okay? So we consider this perception, right? So something's happening where the brain is computing, I see this thing, okay? And then it's going to disappear, and then we're going to have conscious awareness, right? And so there's this claim that with, for example, Sperling's experiments, that participants had perceptual awareness, okay, because they obviously saw specific shapes of a lot of the letters in the row that they had to report back, but they might not have had conscious awareness in some of the other pieces that they missed, right? And so it kind of comes back down to, can attention and consciousness happen without one another? Can we have the perception without the awareness, or the awareness without the perception? And Putnam puts it pretty interestingly. Okay, she's a philosopher that said basically there's no way of answering the question whether there is unreportable consciousness if the person can't report what they didn't experience. So this all brings us back down to, is it that attention and consciousness don't exist, or are just different? Maybe they're forms of thinking, right? How do we measure these things in relation to one another? And is it possible that these two things really aren't individual at all? And because we can't locate very specific parts distinguishing them in the brain, are they illusory, or are they just simply not what they seem? So this is an interesting theory. This is an interesting set, like a not necessarily a theory. It's a possibility, I would say. But the problem with this is that if you assume that they don't exist, and if you assume that they're not what they seem, then it's going to reduce the number of people that want to study it. Because if you come to the conclusion that they aren't distinct, they're not measurable, they are illusory, then that means, if this is the possibility that's true, this means that we can't study it because it's next to impossible to identify. So you have your 6 possibilities, okay? They all have some strengths and weaknesses. Some of them have support, some of them don't. Some of them have evidence that says completely contradictory. So none of the possibilities are 100% supported by all the fields, simply because there are so many problems with each of these potential possibilities. So we're going to pick back up on meditation when we get back in. And so we're going to talk about the connection between what the brain is doing during meditation, and how that's connected to subjective awareness, and how mindfulness is also involved in this process as well.